Hi everyone, welcome to another workshop presented to you by the Writing Support Center. My name is Genesis and I'm one of the faculty members here at the Writing Support Center. And today we're going to be talking about how to write and annotate an annotated bibliography, a look into writing annotations for sources. An overview of today's agenda, we're going to be discussing what is an annotated bibliography, what does an annotation include, annotation categories and styles, types of annotations, and lastly, the writing styles that you can use when putting together an annotated bibliography. Some expectations for this workshop. To get the most out of this workshop, you will need to complete the accompanying worksheet that is found in the module. So if you just go back, download that Word document or that PDF and fill that out. So if you're receiving extra credit or this is a part of an assignment, this will be the method that you show your professor that you have completed this workshop. We also encourage you to take your time. Feel free to pause and rewind parts that were confusing or went too fast. This is a video for you to take at your own pace, so do not feel the need to rush through it. What is an annotated bibliography? An annotated bibliography is an extension to a bibliography, otherwise known as the works cited page or the references page, depending on whether you are writing in MLA or APA format. It includes descriptions and explanations of your sources that go beyond the basic citation information. So normally with a works cited page or a references page, you're just including information in regards to who the author was, the title of the work that you're using in your essay, the date of publication, where it was published, etc. An annotated bibliography includes a summary of the source and how it applies to your research. So it takes it a little further by providing more information than you would normally give. And you might be wondering why your professor is asking you to write one, or why it's a good idea to write one as part of your planning stage of your essay. So first, readers can refer to a citation and then go look up the material and cross-reference with your interpretation. Because you're including a summary and how it applies to your research, you're applying your personal insight in regards to the work. So that could be really helpful if you ever publish your essay in an academic journal, or if you ever present it at a conference. It's helpful for others to see how you utilize the source, and it helps them make an informed decision as to whether or not they want to use it. It also provides specific information about each of your sources. This type of information is usually information that cannot be found in an abstract or even just a general works cited entry. So it really is taking it a step further. A way that we like to think about it is as if you're providing a friend with a list of good movies with explanations about each one, and you're giving them enough information for them to make an informed decision as to whether or not they want to watch it. So your annotated bibliography is essentially serving the same purpose. And that actually leads us into our warm-up activity. So to complete this activity, please go back to the accompanying worksheet that is found in the module, as we mentioned before. And for this activity, you will need to think of a movie or TV show that you've recently watched that you would like to recommend to a friend. Write a short summary of the movie that includes details to help your friend decide whether to watch it. Be sure to include the title of the film and why you're recommending it. So you don't need to write a works cited entry. We don't need to know the director, all that stuff. This is just to get you started into thinking about putting together a summary um, for a source. So just think about what were the main things that happened in the film or the TV show, and why you recommend your friend to watch it. Once you have completed the activity, now we're going to be talking about what does an annotated bibliography do. So, as I mentioned before, an annotated bibliography is an opportunity to provide more information on a source. It also encourages you to think critically about the content of the works you are using, their place within the field of study, and their relationship to your own research and ideas. So, you're really trying to assess the source and see how it is useful and um, essentially the strength of the source in terms of the field of study. Um, it situates your study and topic in a continuing professional conversation. So one thing to always keep in mind is while you're still a student, you participating in research makes you a scholar. And doing this kind of research really helps put you as a part of a professional conversation of researchers and scholars all across the world. So when you're putting together an annotated bibliography, you're really providing a focus for your research and telling someone how this research relates to everyone else's work. It provides a way for others to decide whether a source will be helpful to their research. So again, thinking of it as like a movie recommendation, you're providing information for someone to make a decision whether or not they want to watch it. The same concept applies. Others will read this annotated bibliography and decide whether that source will be helpful for their research because they're seeing how it related to yours. And so then they're able to take your insight and apply it to their own work. Right. Elements of an annotation. So these are things that an annotation should include when you're writing an annotated bibliography. The first being you want to make sure that you are using the appropriate citation style, MLA, APA, CBE, or CSE. Um, this will normally be determined either by the class that you are writing this for, the subject, or what your professor recommends. If you're writing an English paper, for example, you will most likely be using MLA formatting. If you're writing a sociology paper, you'll most likely be using APA. If you're writing a paper for a um, a bio class or a medical class, you would probably be using CBE or CSE. It includes an explanation of the main points and or the purpose of the work, otherwise known as the thesis. So you are telling the reader what the thesis is and what the main points that the author brought up in order to support that thesis. You are verifying or critiquing the authority or qualifications of the author in the age of information being at the tip of our fingertips through the internet. One thing that has become really important is being able to analyze and criticize our sources and be able to determine whether a source is a credible source. And a lot of that comes from the author that is putting it together. So you need to look at who the author is, what their qualifications are, whether they're writing for a certain purpose, what their point of view is, their perspective, are there any biases, and in an annotated bibliography, you would need to acknowledge those things. Your annotation also comments on the worth, effectiveness, and usefulness of the work in terms of the topic being researched and or your own research project. So you would need to mention again whether the source is very useful, whether it's lacking information, or whether it's very thoroughly researched, and if there was anything missing, and how it applies to your own research project. So how did you use this source in your essay? And then it also links to other works done in the area, such as related sources, possibly including a comparison with some of those that are already on your list. So if you find that two sources work really well together, they complement one another, that would that might be something that you mention in your annotation, just so that way your reader kind of sees how you're connecting your sources together, and how they relate to one another, as opposed to all of these sources being standalone. Or likewise, if they contradict one another, why do they contradict one another, and why did you choose two sources that contradict one another? So that might be helpful if you're writing a compare and contrast essay, and you have to put together an annotated bibliography for that. That would be something that you would need to acknowledge. Annotation categories and styles. So as we mentioned, you will you will need to decide which citation format you will be using in order to make sure that you're putting together the annotation and the bibliography correctly. Normally, bibliography should be double spaced and use normal margins, so 1-inch margins all around, unless otherwise specified by your professor. So the first is MLA, also known as the Modern Languages Association. This is an annotation style that is primarily used in humanities, such as English, languages, etc. These annotations will normally be summary or analytical annotations, and we will talk a little more about what those specifically entail in a couple of slides. It follows MLA format with a hanging indent. So if you would like more information as to how to put together a works cited page for MLA formatting, I do recommend that you go check out our Cite It Right MLA formatting workshop that is found in our virtual workshop module. It was put together by the PCC librarians, and it goes into more detail as to how to put together a works cited page and in MLA formatting. The annotation will begin after the bibliography information. So once you finish typing in the works cited entry, you would begin the paragraph right after that. So you wouldn't start a new line. You would just continue straight through. And it is normally titled Annotated Bibliography. So it has a very specific title that you would need to use if you're putting one together. For APA formatting, otherwise known as the American Psychological Association, this is a formatting style that is used primarily for the natural and social sciences, econ, business, and criminology. These annotations consist of succinct summaries, so they're very straightforward and to the point. They also utilize the hanging indent similar to MLA. Again, if you would like more information as to how to put together an APA references page, I recommend that you check out the workshop Cite It Right APA Formatting, also hosted by the PCC librarians. The annotation begins one line below the citation. So instead of continuing on the way that you would with MLA, you would press enter and start a new line for the paragraph. And these are normally titled references. CBE and CSE, also known as the Council of Biology Editors or the Council of Science Editors, these are citation styles that I use for plant sciences such as zoology, microbiology, and medical sciences. Unlike MLA or APA, they don't have a specific title for their annotated bibliography page. You can just refer to it as a references or whatever it is that your professor wants you to refer to it as. They're usually in a smaller font than the rest of the paper, meaning that if your paper was in 12-point font, then your works cited page or your references page in this citation style would be 11-point font. And if you're using a name year formatting similar to MLA or APA, the annotation would be aligned with the left margin with all additional lines indented. So the first line would match the citation and then everything else would be indented. Types of annotations. So in the previous slide, we mentioned summary annotations and analytical annotations. So we're going to be going over specifically what those entail. To start off, summary annotations, just like it sounds, you're summarizing the content of the source and giving an overview of arguments, the proofs, evidence that were discussed, and the conclusion of the source. It very much will read like a book report. You're just giving an overview as to what the source was about. And you also describe the author's methodology, how the author did their research. Informative annotations, they read like straight summaries, but they often spend a little more time summarizing relevant information about the author or the work itself. So you are giving a little more detail in regards to the author, their background, what makes them a qualified source, and you're also giving a little more information about the source as well. Indicative annotations. They're another type of summary annotation, but rather than including information about the argument itself, you're giving more so general information into what kinds of questions or issues were addressed by the work. So this would include either chapter titles or section titles that were included. You're not so much giving us insight into the methodology of the author or the main points. You're just giving us an overview, a general overview as to what the source discussed and how, and the issues that were addressed. And lastly, there's critical and evaluative annotations. So again, you're also addressing the summary, but you actually evaluate the source and author critically. So you address any biases, if there was any lack of evidence, how well the author supported their argument, whether there were any, whether there was anything missing, etc. So you're actually going a little deeper and actually providing an analysis of the source and whether or not the source was useful. Um, and you also explain how the source helped your own project. So you mentioned how you use the source in your essay. And this kind of annotation is actually really helpful in the beginning stages before you actually start writing your research paper, because it actually makes you start thinking about how you're going to utilize the source from the very beginning, and how you're going to incorporate it. And you start talking about that in annotated bibliography, which can help provide some direction and some planning for the essay. One thing to keep in mind is that you don't just have to write in one of these specific styles. You can combine any of these styles. And you may have noticed that some of these are already just different forms of the summary annotation. So, for example, the informative, indicative, and critical, all of those include summaries. They just include summaries in different ways. And some of them may ask you to evaluate on a certain topic rather than focusing on another. So you can combine any of these styles. Do not feel like you need to stick to one specific style. Questions to ask while you're researching and writing. So in addition to keeping in mind the types of styles uh, that you can use while writing your annotation, these are just some questions to help you brainstorm exactly what you want to focus on or what you want to write when you're putting together your annotated bibliography. The first being, do you know who wrote the source? What qualifications does the writer have? And why do you think the writer wrote it? Do they have a self-interest or a political viewpoint they might want to that might make them overly biased? So again, we're being critical of our sources. We're being critical of the writer um, who is putting it together, and we're really evaluating how they wrote it and their purpose for writing it, and we're acknowledging that in the annotated bibliography. Does the date of publication influence or affect the research? Um, just looking at the content or the context of when this paper was written and how that might have influenced the essay or the research that you're using. Are you keeping your summaries brief and to the point, focusing on the point your research source is trying to make? So again, trying to decide the type of annotation style that you want to use. So are you going to do something that's more succinct and straightforward, or are you going to provide a little more information um, in regards to the source? If it's part of the assignment, are you including a sentence or two about how you see this piece of research fitting into your overall research project? So again, thinking about how you're utilizing the research and how it's relevant to what you're putting together. With that, we're going to go back to the accompanying worksheet and complete a annotation writing activity. So to complete this activity, choose one of the two prompts below. So again, you're only choosing one. You don't have to answer both of these. You're just going to choose the one that you feel is most relevant to you. The first prompt reads, if you're currently working on a research paper for class, refer to one of the sources you are using. Write an annotation entry for that source. Be sure to take into account the citation style, such as MLA, APA, or CBE, CSE, for your class and the type of annotation you are writing. So um, you're using one of the sources that you're already planning on using for your research paper, and now you're just getting started on that annotation. So again, think about the citation style because that's going to affect the structure of the annotation that you're using. And think about the type of annotation that you want to use when you're writing. So, are you going to be using a summary? Are you going to be using informative, indicative, critical, or evaluative? So, take that into consideration when you're writing um, the annotation. If you're currently not working on a research paper, go to latimes.com and select an article from today's current events. Read through the article and then create a summary annotation for that source using MLA formatting. Um, so if you're not working on a research paper, you're just going to select an article and read through it and provide a summary. And lastly, there are some writing styles that you can use when you're putting together an annotated bibliography. The first being telescopic. This type of style is a study in succinctness, so it's really straightforward. It tells information that is relevant and it has a very straightforward sentence structure that doesn't sacrifice the clarity. While this may seem easy, this type of writing style is actually harder than it seems because, again, you're being really straightforward while also being very specific. So you're not being general, you're providing specific information as to what the source was about without sacrificing without getting into flowery language or getting off topic. You also have the paragraph style. So if your professor asks for this type of style, they're expecting a more in-depth description or evaluation of the source. You want to make sure that you're providing a full paragraph of discussion for each work. So you're really just writing a full paragraph and a full description as to what the source was and what the author talked about. In summary, bibliographies and annotations are a series of organized steps that really help give a testimony of your research and your work, and they give insight as to how you're utilizing the research in your essay. And they're really helpful in the beginning stages before you actually start writing because they help you start thinking about how you're going to utilize your research rather than you writing your paper and trying to fit your research um, as you go along. There's several different types of annotations that you can utilize, and all of them work just as well. It just depends on how you want to relay the information. And with that, thank you. As always, you're more than welcome to visit the Virtual Writing Support Center and meet with a tutor if you would like more information about how to work on an annotated bibliography. If you would like to meet with a tutor, just click back into the student Canvas shell, click on the red button that says Meet with the Tutor, and one of our tutors will be able to assist you. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day.